Chapter 38 then, at a very high level, can be broken into these two headings. The first 17 verses is God bringing Gog against Israel, and that's very particularly worded. It's not Gog coming down of its own accord, it's God bringing them down. And we'll see that as a really key emphasis of this chapter. God brings Gog down against Israel. And then having brought them down, in verse 18, what's the response? And it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come down against the land of Israel, saith Yahweh, that my fury shall come up against my face. And so now his response to the coming down of Gog, which they think is just in their own might, is in fact to then destroy them. And that's covered then from verse 18 to the rest of the chapter. So that's just a really convenient high-level way of looking at chapter 38. So something that's perhaps not as well known about Ezekiel 38 is that the overall structure of the prophecy, or the overall picture of the prophecy, is actually echoing a historical event that had already occurred by the time Ezekiel gave the prophecy. It's an event that is covered in Brother John Orfrey's book on Ezekiel. I've heard it referred to in a couple of other talks by other brethren such as Roger Lewis, but apart from those, I wouldn't say I've heard it referred to very often. And what that particular historical event is that around about 630 BC, there was a nation north of Israel called the Scythians, and they were only very strong for a relatively short period of time, but they actually conducted an invasion from the north right through the north of the Middle East down into Israel and almost as far as Egypt. And they were intending to take Egypt, and Egypt paid them off and they disappeared again. So if you look at this slide, this is an example of what is being referred to. This is from Brother Orfrey's book. So you can see the Scythians are from an area above the Black Sea originally. Here's the Black Sea here. And then they came through Turkey, through the Fertile Crescent, into the land of Israel, and then got close to getting into Egypt. And when they passed through Israel, because it was really just some place that they were going through in order to get to Egypt, they just took one town called Beth-shan. And historically, you can see evidence of that because when in the Greek period, the Greeks actually renamed this town Scythopolis after the Scythians. So if you look in your Bible, in the maps at the back of your Bible, you'll see the one that's during Old Testament times calls the city Beth-shan, but if you look in the time of the Herods in the New Testament, it's called Scythopolis. So 630 was some decades before Ezekiel gave the prophecy, but they were already familiar with the idea of a group of people released later called the Scythians, from the far north of Israel, coming down from that area and through the Middle East and taking their own land, as well as going further down towards Egypt. So that's sort of important because it helps then to see how readers in Ezekiel's time would have read a description of an invasion from the north involving these countries. It wasn't something that was completely new to them. So if we now just go back to this slide here. So obviously in Ezekiel 38, it doesn't actually mention Scythians by that particular name, but some of the key nations involved are Gomer, Magog, Tubal, Meshech and Tyrus. Tubal, Meshech and Rosh. Now, interestingly, all those five nations are taken from are all descendants of the one son of Noah, Japheth. He had a number of sons, and some of those, the ones I've got in bold there, Genesis 10 verse 2, are featured in Ezekiel 38. So you've got Gomer, Magog, Tubal, Meshech, and then Tyrus, which will show is actually likely the nation, the son from which Rosh came from. And Brother Orpheus has got a couple of references here that then link Magog and Tyrus with the name Scythian. So the Magogites were the nation that came from Magog, but the Greeks later called them Scythians. And Tyrus, from the Encyclopedia Britannica here, it points out here that they were called Scythian by the Greek Scythians or Tauro-Scythians as well, because the territory they occupied was very near one another, so they sort of blended into one another, so they ended up being called Scythians as well. And then those Tauro-Scythians themselves called themselves Rus or Rosh. And if you have a look at this next map here, they lived up here, and there's all sorts of names that incorporate both Scythia and names that sound like Tyrus. So you've got Tyrus Pole, the river Tyrus, Thrace, which isn't far off Tyrus in a different language, and then the Scythians themselves who are up here. And the Tyrians were sort of around this area, and then the Scythians were sort of around there, but they kind of blended in, as I said, their territory. So as a result, people tended to group them together under one name. So when somebody in Ezekiel's time looked at this prophecy and heard names like this, they would have thought, oh, yeah, we just saw something like that a few decades ago. We've got a pretty good idea of roughly what's being described. So it gives us some confidence when we sort of go through the standard lecture type material of in detail identifying each one of these nations, which we don't have time to do tonight, that when we complete that exercise, we end up with nations that are the same as we could derive looking at it that way as well. It's not something that it's just something that's consistent as a conclusion with the origin of those nations derived from Genesis chapter 10, which is very helpful because it should make sense to the people at the time as well as people who lived later, at least to some degree. So with that in mind then, they would have seen that, and that is, of course, what Ezekiel 38 is predicting. Again, a power from the north, above the Black Sea. Here's Meshach and Tubal in Brother Orpheus' diagram coming through this area of the Fertile Crescent, through Turkey, and down into Israel. And we know from Daniel 11 that they too go past Israel down to Egypt before they then turn around and go back. But in the case of Rosh, in the latter day, they do actually take Egypt rather than what happened in AD and BC 630 when they almost did and decided not to bother going any further and took the money instead. But very similar. So that's a useful analogue to have, or an analogy. All right, so with that sort of background, I want to have a look then at what the overall message of Ezekiel 38 is portraying, one of the key themes. So when I introduced this class, I described what the key message of this whole section of the restoration is about, and you can see that idea of showing that God's promises to Israel will be fulfilled and that the Gentiles will be judged, both come through clearly in Ezekiel 38. Now, if we have, and it's easy when we look at Ezekiel 38 in a lecture to miss that overall picture because we end up by necessity getting quite detailed in looking at individual nations and their histories and trying to understand, therefore, what their modern equivalent of those nations is, and then thinking even about current events and how that fits in. But in the course of doing that, we can then sometimes sort of miss the overall view of what's going on in the chapter. And one of the key points that comes through when you look at Ezekiel 38 in an overall sense is that the emphasis is, as I said, that God is bringing Gog down. Even though it looks like this is going to be a tragedy for Israel because they're about to be invaded by Gentile nations, in the description of them coming down, it keeps on pointing out that actually this is something God's doing. So if you just have a look at this slide here, I've just picked out some examples. So let's have a look together at starting with verse 4. After describing some of the components of the confederacy, it specifically says, I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws. So it's not something they wanted to do. and I will bring thee forth. So there's 3 repeated phrases there that emphasise what's going on here. It looks terrible, but I'm behind it. It's not just these people doing it themselves. Then verse 8, after many days thou shalt be visited. And as I've got there on the slide, the SV and the NASB have sort of got slightly clearer translations here, mustered or summoned. So this is God doing this. God is mustering or summoning Gog to come down. It's not them just choosing to do it of their own accord. Then verse 16, thou shalt come against my people Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days, and I will bring thee against my land. Why? That the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. So God's bringing them down, and the purpose of it is to show that he's in control, and his name and the purpose exhibited it was in fact going to be fulfilled before their very eyes. So again, God is in control. And then in verse 17 he goes on to say, and I didn't just decide to do it at the time. Actually, verse 17, you're he that I spoke about centuries ago that I would do this. I was spoken in old time by my servants, the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them. So not only is God doing it then, he'd said a long time ago that he was going to do it. So you can see just from that selection of verses then that there's a real emphasis there on God being behind what's happening. And that fits, as I said, with the whole theme of this section of Ezekiel on the restoration of Israel. But we can sort of miss that theme if we are really in the microscopic sort of analysis of individual names and time periods, which is important too, but it's good to sometimes step back and see the overview. Then, in line with the second part of the theme of the restoration, Ezekiel 38 goes on from verse 18 to talk about the fact that even though these people were coming down, they weren't going to end up having the victory. God was going to destroy them completely. And the emphasis is on the fact God is doing this. Because if you look again back through the chapter, it actually specifically makes the point back in verse 10, while you're coming up, or as you're coming up, you're going to have a thought in your mind, while I'm moving, I might go actually there and take all the riches that the Jews have accumulated in their land, to take a spoil and take a prey in the language of the verse in the King James. That is clearly described as a sort of separate thing from the fact that God has actually brought them down in the first place. Their motive isn't introduced till verse 11. So then they think they're coming down for that reason, but God's saying, no, actually, I've just spent 10 verses showing you that it's me that's doing it. But then when they come down, they're going to be destroyed. And how is that going to happen? Is it going to be through the might of another nation? Well, what sort of other nation's response is seen to Gog's arrival? Well, verse 13, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish with the young lions, what sort of defence do they put up? All they can do is say, oh, what are you doing here? There's no reference at all to them going into battle against the Gogian Confederacy. It specifically quotes word for word what they're going to say, which is quite a bit of detail, seemingly, for when they could have been summarised in a single phrase. It's surely emphasising it's not human power that's going to destroy Gog. Similarly, is it the Jews? When you read what's said and what isn't said in this chapter, it's actually quite striking. There's almost no reference to the Gogian Confederacy fighting against the Jews, even though we know they do from chapters like Zechariah 14. And even you can infer it from Ezekiel 38 because it says they come into the land and cover it like a cloud. The actual battle isn't mentioned at all. And so any subsequent victory by Jews over Gog later is just not mentioned, nor is the battle in itself. The one and only thing that is said in a lot of detail is from verse 18 onwards, where it describes a whole series of different supernatural events that overthrow Gog. And being supernatural, only God can be responsible for them. And so the way it's presented, again, shows that God is in control, this time in his judging of the Gentile nations in the Confederacy. And so if you look at the description from verse 18 to 23, firstly, there's a great earthquake in verse 19. Then in verse 21, there's this strange scenario where every man's sword is against his brother, and so the Gogian Confederacy's armies actually fight each other rather than being humanly defeated by another army. Then there's more natural events: pestilence, rain, hailstones, fire and brimstone. And hence the conclusion then in verse 23, all natural things, not human things. And hence the conclusion in verse 23, thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself. God is in control, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. And that's one of those phrases to colour in that I was alluding to earlier. So hopefully if you look at that overview of how this chapter's mentioned, including what isn't mentioned, the overall theme of the restoration comes through really clearly in a way that may not have been completely apparent. Now, a few other little things to mention. In verse 17, there's a unusual reference that I alluded to earlier that doesn't generally get a lot of attention in public lectures, which I'll just talk about briefly. It says there, art thou he of whom I've spoken in old time by my servants, the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them. So here God is saying that actually Gog coming down with this confederacy against Israel was something I've talked about a long time ago. It's not just in Ezekiel 38. But when you sort of maybe cast your mind over various Old Testament prophecies, it's hard to think of another one in which Gog is mentioned. And actually it isn't completely straightforward to work out what is being referred to here. And it could be, in fact, that it's one that isn't included in the scriptures, which is perfectly feasible. There's all sorts of revelations that were given to men in the past that were not part of the recorded scriptures. There was all sorts of prophets that didn't even write books, as we know. But there are also some possible references in the Bible itself. So we'll just look at a couple of those briefly. So the one that's probably the most significant is if you come back to Numbers 24, verse 7, again, a very obscure place, just as we were talking about with the prophecies about Edom. Edom shows up in these Balaam prophecies given before Israel came into the land. And so does a reference that could be to Gog. The only problem is it's not in the Masoretic text, it's only in the Septuagint. But it does fit in overall, so I think it's certainly worth considering as a possibility. So the Amalekites are described in various places in these prophecies as coming against Israel and being an example of a eternal enemy to the Jews. And Agag, of course, was a king of the was an Amalekite in the time of David. And if we see in verse 7, there's this little prophecy here that says, he shall pour the water out of his buckets, his seed shall be in many waters, and his king, that's Israel's king, shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. And the Septuagint for Agag actually has Gog. So if that's actually a more accurate rendition than the Masoretic text's rendition, then this is an example of Gog being prophesied coming down many centuries before, because this was given, this prophecy was given before Israel even got into the land. So getting on towards 1,000 years before. So the king of Israel would be higher than Gog. That's obviously Christ, and Christ's kingdom would be exalted. So that's certainly one possibility. Then there's other references in the Old Testament to other prophecies which definitely are speaking about the Gogian invasion, but they just don't happen to mention Gog by name. So they could be what Ezekiel was referring to here as well. Joel chapter 3 is an obvious example of the Battle of Armageddon, and it was given before Ezekiel. There's others that were given around the same time, which can't be what he's talking about. Daniel 11, Zechariah 14, but they're not in old time compared to Ezekiel's time. Joel isn't even a lot before Ezekiel, but he's at least before and not contemporary, as well as Isaiah 24, the latter part of Isaiah 24's got a section in it that's quite similar to the content of Ezekiel 38, but in different language. And then also, we'll get to this point in a sec as well, there's a number of places in the Old Testament where there's effectively types of the Battle of Armageddon presented in other battles that happen, particularly in the times of the judges, but also some others as well. And so it might be that to the discerning reader, Ezekiel is pointing people to those as well. So that's just one little verse I wanted to just focus in on because it's not as commonly covered. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was, picking up that last point, how the punishment of Gog incorporates different punishments that were brought upon Gentile powers in the past by God. And so it's sort of almost like he's collecting together all of these different punishments that have come across upon other Gentile nations and concentrating them all on one final enemy. So, as we said, there's the great earthquake in verse 19, but then in verse 20, then there's all these other particular aspects of the, 19, 20, but then from verse 21 and 22, there's all these other things that happen after that, which combine to destroy Gog. So verse 21 says, I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains. Every man's sword shall be against his brother. And by the way, this material is courtesy of Brother Perce Mansfield from a talk he gave at a Bible school in the 1960s. It was very interesting. So firstly, that sword against the brother is exactly the same thing as what happened in the Judges when Gideon came against the Midianites. And when they broke the lamps, they all panicked and they ended up fighting each other and they were defeated. Pestilence and blood, you can link back to the 10 plagues against Egypt. That was actually one that wasn't in the Uncle Perce's talk. The overflowing rain, that's exactly what happened with Deborah and Barak in their defeat of Sisera, wasn't it? They had the chariots and then the river flowed and the rain came down and the chariots all got bogged and they all were defeated. There's the great hailstones. Joshua now, when he took the 5 kings of the Amorites out at Beth Horon, God intervened and great hailstones came down and they were defeated. And fire and brimstone is obviously a link to Sodom and Gomorrah. And so you can see in that there's likely to be some types of Armageddon in these events, just from the fact that each of them ends up appearing in this point alone in Ezekiel 38, if not more. So that's all I want to say about Ezekiel 38, and now we want to move on to chapter 39. Compared to 38, 39 is a little bit more of a neglected chapter in some ways. It just sort of lives in like the rain shadow of Ezekiel 38 because of the time that needs to be spent usually on that chapter in a lecture. And by the time we get to 39, there's not very much time to discuss the rest of the story. But actually, if you look at chapter 39, you can see that it's all part of the same event. Because if you read verse 2, verse 1 of chapter 39, it is exactly the same as the start of verse 3 of chapter 38. Behold, I'm against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And if you look at the latter part of verse 3, behold, I'm against thee, 38 verse 3, behold, I'm against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. So there is a chapter break there put in there by the King James Version editors, but as far as Ezekiel is concerned, it just continues on. It's not two separate prophecies. So the topic continues with chapter 39, and I'll just put a little overview up here of how chapter 39 can be looked at a high level. With Gog having been destroyed, Gog's army having been destroyed in the end of chapter 38, the rest of the chapter 39 then spends a long time describing the burial of Gog's armies and the cleansing of the land of Israel from the remnants of the war that was and the destruction that was undertaken. So that's from verse 1 to 16. Then verse 17, there's a new little section in the prophecy. It sort of starts, and thou son of man, thus saith Yahweh. So it's kind of like a new little passage. And from there through to about verse 20, or you could say even down to verse 22, it's a little bit grey where you would choose to put that break. You can see that there's sort of like a new scene depicted. It's not really a new topic, but it's just new language. It talks about assembling every feathered fowl and beast of the field together and coming down to a sacrifice. So we've entitled that section The Sacrificial Feast. I think these are from Brother Alfrey as well, from memory. And then the last section then focuses back on Israel. See verse 23. The heathen shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity. We switch now back to talking about what happened with the Jews rather than what was happening with Gog. And you might think, well, why has that happened? We've already talked about Israel going into captivity. And when we get there, you'll see there's a good reason for that, because it's not quite the same thing as what was said before, after all. Now, the first part of the chapter, through to verse 16, on the burial of Gog's armies, is got a number of difficult translations in the King James. So I'm going to put up a table which just provides some alternative translations to various phrases in those verses, which will hopefully help at least put together some basic features of this section. So firstly, Daisy, that's what I'm looking for. So if we look at verse 2, it starts, I will turn thee back, very familiar language, and leave but the sixth part of thee, and cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. Interesting, just in passing, to see the mountains of Israel there again. They appeared back in chapter 38 as well, in verse 8, gathered against the mountains of Israel, and they're mentioned at least twice in this chapter as well. So that continued theme from chapter 36 and 37 with the mountains of Israel is here as well. It's all part of that wider section on Israel's restoration. So we've got the familiar points about being turned back, being brought from the north parts. But then there's this phrase in the King James that says, leave but the sixth part of thee. And it turns out that that translation is not picked up by any of the others that I could find, and it seems to widely accepted to be inaccurate. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to think that God would bring down 5/6 of Gog's army and leave a sixth behind for some reason. The other translations are much more innocuous and just say that instead of leaving the sixth part of thee, it's God will lead Gogian confederacy on or down into the land, which is perfectly consistent with what God said back in 38 verse 4. I will turn thee back, put hooks into thy jaws and bring thee forth, 38 verse 4. So that bring thee forth would line up very nicely with I'll lead thee on. So I think it's pretty safe in assuming that that is the more accurate translation. And it then goes on to quickly recap on the destruction of Gog. I'll smite thy bow out of thy left hand, cause thine arrows to fall out of thy right hand, and thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel, thou and all thy bands. And I will give thee to the ravenous birds of every sort, and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. Now, that little phrase there about the beasts of the field and the ravenous birds, we will defer looking at until we get to verse 17, that second section about the feast and the sacrifice, because those birds and beasts are mentioned in more detail then. But just note that they are referred to here briefly. No doubt there is some literal description, application of that to the situation. There were literal soldiers that will be on the field that have been put to death, and there will be literal birds and animals that will eat their carcasses. But the way it's used in verse 17 onwards shows that there's clearly a wider, more spiritual, figurative application to that language as well. Then in verse... Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong reference there. That second point in the table should be verse 6, not verse 4. Verse 6 says, "And I will send a fire on Magog and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles." Quite a distinctive little phrase, carelessly in the isles. But again, it suffers a bit from a combination of Old English and not entirely accurate translations. So carelessly is probably better translated securely or safely. And the isles is not meant to be simply an island, but just somewhere with a coast. So hence the ESV has securely in the coastlands. Not to say that islands couldn't be amongst them. Of course, islands have coasts as well, but it's not purely confined to islands is the point that's being made. And why are they dwelling securely then? That sort of all makes sense, because they are under the protection of Gog of the land of Magog. We saw back in chapter 38 that that Gog is a guard to all of these nations that are confederate with it. For instance, in verse 7, be a guard unto them. So that's why these other countries are able to be secure, because they have the protection of Gog of the land of Magog. But of course, a fire is in fact being sent upon them. Now, if we then continue down to verse 11, the next point we want to make is about what happens to Gog after it's been destroyed. So without going to verse 8 to 10 much, you can see that very briefly it talks about the children of Israel, so the mortal Jews that are in the land after the Gogian confederacy, that have been rescued from the Gogian armies by Christ and the saints. They go around and burn the weapons of war that were used by the Gogian confederacy and spoil those armies that had previously spoiled them. Then in verse 11, though, we get to a curious section from there to the end of verse 16, which goes into a lot of detail describing how the Jews in the land, the mortal Jews at that time, are going to bury the bodies of the Gogian confederacy's soldiers and set up a mausoleum and cleanse the land of dead bodies and any bones that are still hanging around. All sorts of unusual detail, which we'll think about the reason for in a moment. But in the course of doing that, it uses some language again that isn't particularly clear. So in the King James, there's all this reference from verse 11 to 16 to passengers, which to us sounds more like it's somebody on a train or something. But it's not a good translation by modern English standards, at least. Maybe it was in the 1600s. But travellers is a much better translation these days to use rather than passengers. So it's people that are mortal Jews that are moving through their land. They've been given the land of Israel after the Gogian confederacy has been removed. They've been rescued from the Gogian confederacy by Christ and the saints. They've gone back into their land if they've been taken away, because a number of them have been, as Zechariah 14 describes. They go into captivity. Joel 3 says the same thing. They've been rescued by Christ and the saints, and they're back in their land. They're travelling through their land, maybe moving into their different tribal allotments that are being allocated to them. And as they're travelling around, they're doing lots of other things as well. So verse 11, they're seeing the way the land is strewn with the remnants of the destruction of Gog. And so what happens? What do they do with all of that? So, as I said, there's a lot of detail provided in this chapter about why they do that. So, and what they do. So firstly, I just missed a point about verse 9. It's interesting that the burning of the weapons that they do, at the end of verse 9 it says they burn them with fire for 7 years. And you'll see the number 7 crops up a couple of times in this section, and that's significant, isn't it? Because 7 is the covenant number, and that fits in perfectly with the theme of this whole section of the restoration, that God's covenant with Israel, that they would have the land forever, was going to be fulfilled no matter what it looked like at the time of Ezekiel. So it's appropriate then that it takes them 7 years to burn the weapons of war that are left behind by the Gog Confederacy. Then in verse 11, getting back to where we were, we find that they set up a valley in which the graves of Gog are set up. Now it says in verse 11, the valley of the passengers on the east of the sea. Now, I think probably valley of travellers is probably the right way to translate this, but it's at least interesting that the Hebrew word is Abarim, which is also a name, and there's nothing in the Bible to help us elsewhere work out where this valley of Gog's bodies is. And it merely just says here east of the sea, which is probably reasonable to surmise as the east of the Dead Sea. But Abarim is an area east of the River Jordan, just above the Dead Sea. So it may be that the valley of the travellers is in fact intended to have a double meaning and mean the valley of the area of Abarim, which Brother Alfred suggests is how it should be taken. I'm a bit more doubtful, which is why I'm suggesting perhaps it's got a double meaning. Looking at the rest of the way the section works, that word is always translated to mean travellers, but maybe it's both. In any case, it helps us out with a hint about where that could be. So east of the Dead Sea, there's a valley set up in which the graves of Gog are placed. And then, so I'll go to here, it has this really strange phrase in verse 11, and it shall stop the noses of the passengers. Now, there's some problems with this phrase in the King James. Obviously, we've addressed the word passengers already. The noses is in italics, and there's no Hebrew there at all for noses. And if you look at other translations, it's much more like, I don't know what you were reading from, Luke, but it sounded quite similar to this. Was that the New King James? Yeah. So I've got the ESV here and the NASB, and also Green's, which is a really good literal translation. And it says, stop those that pass by. So the travellers, Green's has stop those that pass by. ESV and NASB are a bit different, but similar. And basically, it's such a significant sight that people travelling past there would have to stop and see what is there. I think that's a sense of what it is. It's a huge mausoleum to the defeat of Gog. And people travelling in that area are compelled to stop and see what is there. Could be a little open to interpretation, but I think that is the sense of it. And then it goes on to say that valley was also going to be called Haman Gog at the end of the verse there. And as you may have in your margin, if you've got a King James, Haman Gog can be translated as the valley of the multitude of Gog. So the valley of Haman Gog becomes the valley of the multitude of Gog. And I think that fits in really well, because when you read Ezekiel 38, there's a lot of emphasis on that enormous number of people that are in this Gogian confederacy. So saying the multitude of Gog would be very fitting. Then verse 12, another interesting 7 pops up. We've already had 7 years of burning the bodies, and now we've got 7 months shall the house of Israel be burying them. burning the bodies, burning the weapons, and then 7 months they're burying the bodies that they may cleanse the land. So once again, the covenant is being fulfilled, literally, and it takes them the covenant number of years, or months in this case, to do the job. Very appropriate. Then continuing into verse 13, there's another phrase that is quite tricky in the King James. In fact, it's almost meaningless by modern English standards. It says, "Yea, all the people of the land shall bury them." That's fine. And then it says, "And it shall be to them a renown the day that I shall be glorified." And it shall be to them a renown the day that I shall be glorified. I couldn't make sense of that at all. And other translations are quite helpful. It will bring them renown on the day that I glorify myself. It will bring them renown on the day that I glorify myself. So the people are burying Gog, and the work that they will do will glorify God and give renown to the people involved as well. And Gog will be renowned as of no power whatsoever. And then verse 14, the last of these unusual verses or phrases, "They shall sever out men of continual employment." Now, that's better translated, "set apart men to travel through the land regularly," as the ESV has. So what are they doing? There's these people that are specially appointed to travel through the land to bury Gog and cleanse it. All right, so there's already people doing this that are passing through anyway and seeing bones and arranging for things to be buried. But then there's this special people specially allocated to the task, and they do that after the 7 months that was referred to at verse 12. So the people that are passing through the land take 7 months to bury Gog, but then there's these other people in verse 14 that are specially appointed to travel through the land continually to cleanse the land after those 7 months. And travellers that in verse 15 come across a bone, they set up a little sign and say, "Hey, this hasn't been buried yet." And then the men of continual employment come along and take the bone, and it's buried. And in the place that this is done, as we said before, is Haman Gog. But also in this valley, it says in verse 16 that there's going to be a city set up there called Hamona as well. So there's quite a memorial to the fate of Gog. And by this point, I'm hopefully seeing what I was indicating earlier, that there's a very surprising amount of detail given in this chapter about this burial of Gog and the cleansing of the land. And you might think, why is this? I mean, it's relevant, but why so much detail? And this next slide will hopefully just help illustrate this. And this is also from largely from some observations from Brother Perce Mansfield. Basically, if you look at the end of Gog in chapter 38 and 39, there's a whole series of contrasts that really add drama to what we're seeing. Contrasts between what God promised and what Gog was going to end up like. So I'll just run through these now, looking right back from chapter 34 to chapter 39. So contrasts between Yahweh and Gog. So God promised in chapter 37 that Christ would be a shepherd prince over Judah and Israel combined, a confederacy of Judah and Israel as one people. But in chapter 38 and 39, we've got Gog, who's also a prince, but in this case, a confederacy of Rosh, Meshech, Tubal, and a whole series of other nations. Then we've got Israel in chapter 37, in the chapter we looked at last class, being brought out of their graves from a valley of dry bones. And that contrasts beautifully with all the detail we've just read now, where Gog is put into a valley of bones, the valley of Haman Gog, and is placed into graves rather than brought out of graves. Once you see that, all of it makes sense. It's all part of a grand contrast that illustrates the drama of what's happening. God is in control, Gentiles are judged, Israel is restored. And once you see that at a sort of wider view of this section, a lot of this all makes sense, just like it did when we were looking at why is Edom mentioned as Mount Seir specifically, because it contrasts with the mountains of Israel. One mountain range in Mount Seir, one mountain range in Israel. And they're a contrast. Then we've got the great shaking that brings Israel together bone to bone in chapter 37, which contrasts beautifully with the great shaking of Ezekiel 38, which destroys the Gogian confederacy and disintegrates. So one nation's being brought together, the other one's falling apart. Israel's brought back from the sword, Ezekiel 38. Gog is given to the sword, Ezekiel 39. Ezekiel 38 as well. And then lastly, sort of heading a bit beyond this section, we've got this new city that appears in Ezekiel 39 called Hamona. And that which, by the way, Hamona means the multitude, as you might see from your margin. And that contrasts with a new city that's also described later in Ezekiel, which we haven't got to yet. At the end of Ezekiel 38, we've got the city of, Ezekiel 48 rather, we've got the city of Yahweh Shammah, which is part of the new holy oblation that's set up around the area in which the tabernacle, the temple is created. So hopefully that explains all sorts of things about the way this subject is presented in chapter 38 and 39, because it's contrasting what's previously been said in chapters 34 to 37. And I think it's very helpful. So we'll complete now the last two sections of the chapter quite quickly. So verse 17 to 20 roughly, there's a new little section where God says, to every feathered fowl and every beast of the field, come together for a sacrifice upon the mountains of Israel, verse 17 at the end there, that you may eat flesh and drink blood, etc., etc. And then if you scan your eyes down to verse 20, it describes it in a bit more literal language. Thus shall you be filled at my table with horses and chariots and mighty men, and with all men of war. So we're not talking about literal animals being sacrificed. It's a type or a figure for the Gogian armies that have been destroyed. But it does beg the question, who are these feathered fowls and beasts of the field that are being figuratively depicted in this section here? Now, as I mentioned earlier, back in verse 4, when they're first mentioned, the bird's also called a ravenous bird, and as well as the beasts of the field being mentioned there again. Now, if we just turn back to a couple of passages, that will be helpful just to link a couple of ideas together. Firstly, come to Isaiah 46, verse 11. And we'll see here that the idea of a ravenous bird has been used in the past as a symbol. Isaiah 46, verse 11. This is a section in which the coming of Cyrus has been predicted. For instance, at the end of chapter 44, it talks about Cyrus being my shepherd, saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built. And then 45 verse 1 goes on to talk more about Cyrus loosing the loins of kings when he destroys the Babylonians. And that theme continues through to 46, where it says in verse 11, calling a ravenous bird. So there's exactly that same phrase, the ravenous bird, calling a ravenous bird from the east to the man that executeth my counsel from a far country. So a bird is used as a representative of a king that's come from an easterly direction. In this case, it's Cyrus. But what it shows is that the idea of a bird, a ravenous bird, can be used of any king, not just Cyrus, that is directed by God to perform something. And that gives us a very strong clue that that could well therefore be applied in this case in Ezekiel 39 to the Lord Jesus Christ. But not just to the Lord Jesus Christ. So if we just flip back a few more pages to Isaiah chapter 34, we'll see another prophecy where there's some very similar type of language used. And in this case, while it doesn't define these particular symbols here either, it's pretty easy to work out what's going on. So chapter 34 is very similar to Ezekiel because it's talking about verse 1, all the nations being gathered together in the whole world. And in verse 2, God's indignation is coming upon them and they're going to be utterly destroyed. And look at that, even in verse 5, we've got Idumea, the Edomites turning up again, just like in Ezekiel 35. So very, very similar sort of language. It's the verse 8, the day of Yahweh's vengeance and the year of recompense for Zion. These nations are destroyed. Look at verse 6, very similar language to Ezekiel 39 that we're looking at now. The sword of Yahweh is filled with blood, it's made fat with fatness, the blood of lambs and goats, the fat of kidneys of rams, a great sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. Exactly the same language as we've just seen there in Ezekiel 39, verse 17 and 18, with a great sacrifice. And then what happens? Verse 11, but the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it. Here we've got birds. Exactly the same thing as in chapter 39 in Ezekiel. The land is desolate as a result of the war, and instead, what happens? The cormorant and the bittern possess that land. The owl and the raven dwell in it. And then continuing down to verse 14, the wild beasts of the desert. So now we've got our animals as well as the birds dwelling in the land. And they will find a rest for themselves. And then it goes on, if we continue through to chapter 35, to a scene of the kingdom that we know all very well from lectures. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the wilderness blossoms as a rose. So these wild birds and the beasts are clearly the saints, the Gentiles, because they're unclean birds that are mentioned in verse 11, and they're the only ones that are going to be inhabiting the land when it's destroyed when the Gogian Confederacy is destroyed, as well as, of course, the mortal Jews. So putting those two verses together in Isaiah 34 and Isaiah 46, you can see then that the birds and the beasts of the field in Ezekiel 39 then that are being gathered together for a sacrifice are Christ, the ravenous bird, and his followers, the immortal saints, assisted even by the mortal Jews as well, because all of them participate in the overthrow of Gog, but especially Christ and the saints. So that's, I think, the sense of verse 17 to 21. And then lastly, from verse 23, there's just this little recap which talks, seemingly as a recap, about what happened to Israel. But I just want to make a couple of points about this section which show that it's not quite as simple as it might seem. It's actually talking about more than just the old historical regathering of Israel that happened before the return of Christ. So if we just pick it up from verse 23, the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity. And of course that is partly from AD 70, of course. But, and that's because of their transgressions that they trespassed against God, and he hid his face from them. But then he says in verse 25, now, so that's in the past, now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob and have mercy upon the whole house of Israel, be jealous of my holy name, after that they have borne their shame and their trespasses which they have trespassed against me. And then this phrase is the important one, when they dwelt safely in their land and none made them afraid. Now, when did they dwell safely in their land and none made them afraid? The answer to that is before the Gogian invasion. So this captivity that they were sent into and the sinning that they were doing against God when they were in the land and none made them afraid is sinning in the land before the Gogian invasion, after they've been regathered. And then the captivity that they're being sent out to includes the captivity that they went into as a result of the Gogian invasion. Because remember from Zechariah 14, when Gog comes down, Jerusalem's taken captive and half of them are sent off into captivity, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, as well as 2/3 of the land, the inhabitants of the rest of the land are killed. So some of the Jews are actually taken captive by the Gogian army, and Joel 3 talks about that sort of thing as well, being sold to the Grecians and others. So this section here is not just talking about the sinning of Israel against God in AD 70 and all the time subsequently, though it is certainly doing that, but it's also talking about the sinning of Israel that we're seeing right now, the Jews in the land that are increasingly dwelling safely and prosperously, but in so many cases don't acknowledge God at all. They're atheists, or they believe Judaism, which is so different from the truth with all its laws and traditions that have been added into it. And their sins in the land that are happening now are also being incorporated into this description of the captivity, the future captivity that hasn't happened yet, which will occur at the Gogian invasion. God says, from that state, I'm then going to bring them back into the land again. And verse 28, that'll be the last time that ever happens, because in verse 28, it says something different to all the other regathering sections that we've read of before. Then shall they know that I am Yahweh the God which caused them to be led into captivity amongst the nations, but I have gathered them unto their own land and have left none of them any more there. So unlike all the other cases where there was a regathering but there were still Jews left out in the nations, this regathering is different. So this is talking about predominantly the regathering of the second Exodus after the Gogian invasion, when all of the Jews that are left in the nations, both those that have been there for centuries and some that have been sent there recently by Gog following the invasion of Jerusalem, those Jews will be brought back to the land through the second Exodus process we discussed in a previous class, and then brought united with the Jews that are already in the land as one nation under Christ. And so verse 23 onwards is focusing more on that than merely just what had happened before Christ returns. And that's why it's in there. It's otherwise seeming like just a repeat of what was discussed chapters before. It's not just a repeat. It's also taking into account the regathering of the Jews that will happen after the Gogian invasion, both those that were sent out into the nations as captives by the Gogian Confederacy and those that had already been out there since AD 70. And I think that's really useful for final detail to pick up. So with that understood then, we get to the end of chapter 38 and 39 and this whole section on Israel's restoration. And so we finish with this beautiful scene in verse 29. Neither will I hide my face any more from them, for I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, saith the Lord God. And so finally, with Israel restored to their land with a renewed spirit, they know that Yahweh is their God, as it says at the end of that verse. Israel knows that Yahweh is God. But all the nations of the world will also have witnessed Christ and the saints defeat Gog, and they too will be compelled to recognise that Yahweh is God, as one of the verses earlier said, for instance. And so we'll then reach the beautiful point where, as it says in verse 21, God will set his glory among the nations. Mount Zion will be elevated and it will become a house of prayer for all nations. And from Ezekiel 40 onwards to the rest of the prophecy, that's now where Ezekiel switches his focus. He talks in detail now about that future glory that's going to be set amongst the nations in the form of the temple at Mount Zion.